jurors, 278 witnesses, shocking revelations, and 1 billion rand later, South Africa has finally received the first of a three-part report from the Zondo Commission on State Capture. It details how our state was systemically hollowed out over the Zuma years and continues to be a cash cow for the political elite and their cronies, even under the current administration. This is the first part of this report, and it has focused on the SAA, the New Age newspaper, and finally SARS. There are also numerous recommendations on prosecutions which should be made, and we trust that these will begin shortly. This report presents one of the best opportunities for South Africa that it will ever have to establish a culture of accountability and an honest public service. South Africans have waited a long time to see justice served. It is now time to finally redeploy those corrupt cadres to prison. State capture and corruption is not a victimless crime. It steals from all of us and locks millions out of opportunities, leaving them trapped in poverty. And so the discussion this morning, we will be discussing this very report, and I will be joined in studio by DA leader John Steenhuisen, the DA Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Dr. Leon Schreiber, and on Zoom, DA Head of Policy, Gwen Ngwenya, and Law Trust Chair and Social Justice Professor and Professor of Law at Stellenbosch University and the former Public Protector Advocate Thuli Madonsela. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Inside Track for 2022. John, just with you quickly, does the release of the state capture report represent a tide, that we're turning the tide on corruption in South Africa?
Well, I think that it can be if the logical conclusion of it is that we start to see prosecution and consequences. Far too often in South Africa, despite having some of the most advanced laws to protect against financial misconduct, corruption, and mismanagement, very few convictions are ever secured. What we need to see is people being held accountable. And if you look at a lot of the problems that beset local government, provincial government, and national government, as well as the parastatals, there is a lack of a consequence framework there. So people do wrong, they walk away, and nothing happens. They just simply move on to the next government department or next parastatal and carry on with that. And we see that pattern in the entire gamut of state capture. So I think it can be a turning point if it signals a time now for South Africa to start holding people accountable. What that will do is become a clarion call then, and a very clear indication to South Africa that corruption is something we take seriously and that there are consequences for it. As you said, it's not a victimless crime. The real victims of corruption are the 30 million South Africans that live in poverty, have no opportunity, and in which that money that could have built a clinic in their community, improved schools, put teachers in classrooms, created a better environment, a safer environment for them, has been stolen by a very wealthy elite who keep getting away with it. So we've seen reports in the past. We've had reports of inquiry into Nkandla. We had the Farlam Commission of Inquiry. We've had the inquiry into the Serafina debacle. We had the inquiry into the Waterkloof landing. The problem is that when the findings are there, there's very little action against those responsible. So if we really want to turn the tide, we've got to then make sure that people feel the consequences. We've spent this money. We've gone through the pain of having to go through and reveal just how deep the rot has been. Now the natural thing that must follow is the consequences. If we fail that hurdle of making sure there are consequences and that we learn from what has happened, not repeating the same mistakes again, just with different people in charge of government this time, we will be setting ourselves up for the same phenomenon to repeat itself. So the report in itself must be seen not as the end point, it's got to be seen as the starting point. And as I've said earlier, the real swallow that will indicate that the summer of the fight against corruption is here is when we see civil prosecutions, we see people being jailed, we see civil recoveries, we see people being removed from their positions in cabinet and in parliament, people who themselves are the architects of the state capture.
And speaking of the rot, Leon, I mean, when we look at the report itself, I mean, what are the key takeaways, really, especially as it pertains to the impact on the public service?
Well, I think in many ways, Siviwe, this first report is an appetizer of what's to come. It does deal with SAA, it does deal with the South African Revenue Service. In many ways, it confirms the ill dealings that we've known about going on there for quite a long time, and it is important to have that confirmed. But what I think was really striking to me is one of the references made there to how all of these appointments that ended up perpetrating state capture would have gone through a deployment committee within the ANC. And I think that signals, hopefully, where the rest of these reports will be heading, to expose to us not only who some of the top people are who are involved, all those media reports we've read for so many years, but to explain to us how they were actually appointed to positions of power in the first place. Tom Moyane, Dudu Myeni, the people that are now recommended for prosecution and other actions in this first report. The question we have to ask now is how were they put in those positions of power? We've seen a glimpse of that in the form of cadre deployment, and I think that the impact on our public service and our entire public sector, in fact, including SOEs, including Chapter 9 institutions in some cases, that is where the real meat of these findings should and will hopefully be. And that is what, as John says, that is the opportunity we have to harness to make sure that the state capture report becomes a critical juncture for South Africa, where we turn away from cadre deployment, we turn away from patronage and political capture of our public sector, and we move towards building a capable state that separates politics and make sure that we have merit-based appointments in the public sector.
And I want to take and thank you to Professor Madonsela, who has been a key figure in South Africa, particularly when it comes to matters of state capture and the fight against corruption. And so, thank you for lending us your time. I want to take a step back, Prof, and you know, we know that this commission is a result of some of your earlier work, and I would be quite interested to find out whether or not this is for you the logical conclusion. Are you happy with where we are headed and some of the consequences that are hopefully going to come from this?
Good day, and thank you for the privilege. I am happy that the Commission has given us its preliminary views on what happened. Firstly, I would like to indicate that it's still not answered the big question of whether or not the state was hijacked. For example, some of your colleagues have referred to cadre deployment as a major problem. My preliminary conclusions as a public protector was that what we were seeing was not cadre deployment, was hijack. Because if you look at China as a country, they have cadre deployment. What does it mean? It means they deploy the best in their party, people who have been trained in Pudong, in state craft, the best of them. In fact, if you fail, in the past, you literally killed yourself because you couldn't go back home because of a sense of shame. So those who went into the public service, why China has become a global giant is because of cadre deployment. And I'm not for or against, but I'm just saying state capture as we saw it was about the family of President Zuma having gone into business with the Gupta family, and the power given to President Zuma by the people of South Africa being hijacked and repurposed to advance the business interests of these two families. The State Capture Commission, on the other hand, is saying these interests went beyond business interests. Hence, what we saw at SARS, which is more than business interests.
And I mean, and Prof, I mean, so we've got this report, and a lot of people have the question of what now? Where to from now? Are we going to see, or what should happen to make sure, firstly, this hijack, as you say, doesn't happen again? And so, I mean, I'm sure over the years, as you've done this kind of work, a lot of thought has gone into how do we insulate the South African public service from this kind of hijack happening in the future again?
Be vigilant, public, an increase in social leadership so that there's social accountability, but ultimately a much more aware and vigilant parliament. And we've heard here from Honourable Steenhuisen and our colleague, Honourable Leon, that they think that Parliament should do better. And I do think Parliament should do better on two areas. The first one is just making sure that once the report is concluded and the President has indicated what he has done and what he intends to do in terms of the Executive Members Ethics Act and the terms of reference of the Commission, then Parliament monitors what the President has done, and Parliament should also decide what more needs to be done based on its own assessment of what the report has said. The second thing that I think Parliament should do is just based on this report, there's a legislative agenda that emerges. The report spoke about the possibility of deferred prosecution agreements for businesses so that we can get more people who are self-disclosing and helping us to clean up the system in government and everywhere else. We can also begin to amend the Protected Disclosures Act to improve protections for whistleblowers and also to cover this issue of companies that wish to repent and be given something, an incentive for repenting.
Prof, I mean, and then I'm going to bring you in here, John. I mean, one of during the testimonies at the Zondo Commission, previous presiding officers from Parliament gave almost a very grim assessment of Parliament's performance over the years. Do you think that more could have been done from the legislature point of view to try very much in holding the executive to account and perhaps, save South Africa from the extent of what we saw over these past couple of years? And perhaps what is the message to people who are in the legislature now to, trying to make sure that this does not happen again? Prof, are you there?
Yes. Oh, is that the question to me? I thought it was to.
No. I'll bring John now in. I just wanted to find out from you about your thoughts about some of the testimony that was given by the previous presiding officers. Basically, the assessment on Parliament and how it performed or didn't perform in trying to holding the executive to account over the years, and what more can be done.
I think the report is very clear that Parliament is one of the dimensions of our state that didn't step up and play its part. I think part of it is the PR arrangement, in that people are loyal to their party instead of loyal to democracy and the citizens. But the second thing is the toxic relationship between parties in Parliament. And I think now, when we start after this next State of the Nation address, I would recommend that leaders in Parliament come together to agree on what is common ground. Do we all believe that corruption is wrong? Do we all believe that there should be consequences for corruption? Do we all believe that social justice is a constitutional mandate, and that if we don't make progress on social justice, those who are corrupt are going to leverage it and weaponize it against the advances we want to make on the rule of law and anti-corruption?
Yeah, so I think I agree completely with Professor Madonsela, and I think that Parliament was actually also in the dock during the Zondo Commission. And I think, someone who's been a passionate parliamentarian for a very, very long time, I've watched how systematically the teeth of Parliament have been pulled out. When President Mandela was the President of the Republic, we'd have President's questions every 2 weeks. oral questions to the president. You'd have a thing called interpellations, where you're able to take on a minister in an unscripted way, unscripted questions, oral questions. Committees were far more vigilant. But as these oversight mechanisms became uncomfortable for the ANC and for the governing party, they started to pull those teeth out. So we then went to once a month under President Mbeki, to 4 times a year now under President Zuma and President Ramaphosa for questions to the president. So Parliament itself is going to have to sit down and grapple with, how do we become a more effective watchdog against corruption? And yes, the PR system is one of those things. We need to break the power of parties in Parliament and make sure that an MP, whether you're an MP from the ANC or an MP from the DA or from the EFF, your first duty is to the people that have elected you. And you've got to do right by those people. The second thing is being able to have the systems there. Now, far too often, the presiding officers have protected the executive from the tough questions. So we've seen in oral question sessions, and it's there on the record. When tough questions were put to ministers, they were allowed to get away with not answering them. Just last week, Parliament published again the list of unanswered questions from the last term of office. And there are some ministers who've just not answered written questions from members of Parliament. There should be consequences for the executive, and Parliament should not be a comfortable place for the executive. It should be a place where they're held accountable, and it shouldn't be designed to make it easy for the executive to do their job. It should be designed to give MPs, as the people's representatives, the power to be able to ask those tough questions and to drive those changes. And it also goes to the point that the professors made around social justice. So, for instance, parliamentary committees have incredible power to amend budgets. We should be taking money away from spending on nice-to-haves and perks for ministers and flights, and Leon has been involved in exposing how we pay for flights for ex-ministers. Parliament should be an activist parliament and say, we're not going to accept the budget this way. We're making the following amendments to the budget, which is within Parliament's power to do, but it's never done it. And I think that it needs to assert itself far more and not be a lapdog, but be a watchdog for democracy and be an assertive voice for the people of South Africa. So I couldn't agree more with Professor Madonsela.
Absolutely. And I mean, Professor, I want to also just, before we conclude our conversation, it's very, very, very easy to, to become very pessimistic about the future of South Africa. And, you've given us, some food for thought about what Parliament can do, what citizens can do, what civil society can do going forward to make sure that we never end up here. Are you hopeful that we would be able to, save South Africa from the gridlock of corruption? Are you hopeful that we would be able to turn the tide in this way?
Honorable Siviwe, I've never been as hopeful as I am today. Today I received a copy of a book from a 9-year-old, Daniela Takis, Lola the Spy Dog. Please buy it.
I will.
But it's a child's book about what's right and what's wrong. It's a spy book. And of course, it's got nothing to do with state capture. But it's saying to me, this is a little kid who knows the difference between right and wrong. And the bonus is from the proceeds, she's giving 10 Rand to Action for Inclusion, which is a Stellenbosch University student debt initiative. And she's giving 10 Rand to the Trek for Mandela Caring for Girls initiative on pets. I also received this morning a video from the Tuma Foundation on a little boy from Zambia. His name is Oswald. I think Mutapa is in the Mutapa kingdom. And he's talking about Africa needs to think and that people need to be solutions makers. And he is 9 years old. Both of these kids are 9 years old. So if 9-year-olds are saying, let's show up, step up, and fix what is in front of us, what can beat us as grown-ups?
Yeah.
The Commission has lit a torch on what's wrong. What's left is for civil society to show social leadership, parliamentarians to do what we elected them to do, and the executive to do what Parliament has asked it to do. And I think we can do this.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the work that you've done, and the work that you started to get us here. And thank you for lending us your time so that we can have this very important discussion, so that we can start to map out a way forward on how to make sure that we beat corruption.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Wow, what an inspiration. I mean, the real torchbearer of what is right and what is wrong. I mean, remember, this is the lady that brought the Nkandla report. I mean, it took a lot of courage then to stand up to the Zuma regime, and I think that was the start of the big cracks there in the wall, and such a honor to have her on the show with us today.
Absolutely. Almost also reinvigorating, or at least showing us why Chapter 9 institutions are so important, and why these constitutional institutions are so important. And Leon, now I want to get into sort of the nuts and bolts of some of what we have seen, particularly, Professor Madonsela talks about the hijack, and part of your analysis has been that part of the problem has been cadre deployment, or at least the interference of appointments in the public service. What have been some of the things that have been coming out of the minutes that you've been going through? Yeah,
what's really striking to me about this conversation is that I almost get the sense that the State Capture Commission has gone far wider than perhaps even the initial ideas of state capture would have suggested. Because, John and I were up there in Joburg when President Ramaphosa was testifying, and certainly it was clear from the evidence leaders there that they were casting the net wide and looking for the systemic problems also beneath this hijack, as the Prof calls it. So what we've managed to do over quite a long period now of engaging with the Commission and also with the ANC is to get hold of minutes of meetings of the ANC's deployment committee. It covers the period between May 2018 and May 2021. And what it reveals there, and this is evidence that's also before the Commission, which is why I'm saying I'm hopeful that the Commission will also look into this and make a finding in this regard, is that there is a committee within the ANC that meets regularly and discusses and influences appointment decisions through a very, very wide part of the state. 88 different state institutions, government departments. There's discussions about courts and appointments of judges, Chapter 9 institutions, the Human Rights Commission being discussed in these meetings. So what we see for the first time now, even though we've known for 20 years and the DA has been opposing cadre deployment for 20 years, we have now for the first time really solid evidence and proof, documented proof of the fact that this commission exists and how it operates. And in fact, what is also really very striking is that these minutes actually belie some of the testimony we've heard. We've heard a very deceptive approach from someone like Gwen Ngwenya before the Commission. President Ramaphosa at some point said, no, there's no discussion about which judges should be deployed to which positions. We've now seen that, in fact, in the minutes, that is very, very firmly discussed. Names are proposed, and therefore that's why we've also written to the Commission and say you have to look at the potential for perjury in some of this testimony. So these minutes have really been a very, very powerful revelation, and it's exposed the inner workings of cadre deployment.
Gwen, I want to bring you in here. Gwen, as our head of policy, one of the things that we have seen, obviously cadre deployment is a policy of the ANC. What are some of from a policy perspective, how do you think that this has undermined the integrity of the public service? And what do you think is almost the alternative then to that?
Yeah, I think firstly, I'd want to start off by saying that obviously I highly respect Professor Madonsela's comments, especially with the comparison to China. But I do think that what's important, especially what parliamentarians need to bear in mind, is that policies and legislation cannot be formulated around almost your ideal MP or your ideal minister. It is important to consider, what does this legislation enable? What could a weaker or a more nefarious person do with what this legislation enables? And I think that's unfortunately also the perspective that we have to look at it from. And the reality is that even though cadre deployment, one could argue you could deploy highly talented, highly capable individuals, the moment you have such a policy, you do open the door for a different kind of individual, to step in. And so that's exactly what we have seen here. And it's important to recognize that this is a long-standing policy position of the party, which predates the ANC coming into government in 1994, and as early on as the late 1990s, we can see commentary on state capture and how effectively it is working within internal ANC documents. And I think the MO of cadre deployment is really the same, and its fingerprints are all over the Zondo report. So essentially for me, what we understand about how it operates is that individuals loyal to the ANC and to the party, not the objectives of the institutions that they are called to serve, are identified and then made available to be forwarded to ministers and others to appoint in various roles across the state. And obviously this undermines competitive processes. And it's very important to also bear in mind that this is not simply names being forwarded to the party by party representatives simply to inform the party, to keep them up to date, because an argument by those who want to underplay cadre deployment, an argument they have forwarded is to say, well, the minister is a party representative, the president is a party representative. What is wrong with them simply informing the party that these are the people that we are planning to appoint? But I think that is a naive interpretation of what is happening here. This is not simply party representatives accounting or informing the party. These are individuals being lined up by the party itself, ensuring that they are loyal to the party and not the objectives of the institutions. And furthermore, top talent is then denuded in these state institutions. So we've seen in the past senior officials being removed to make way for more loyal and compliant individuals. And lastly, which I think is what brings this part of cadres for their own sake, but for the purpose of weakening, we've seen is that once they have been deployed, is that we can see that governance mechanisms are undermined and the weakening of that institution from within.
Gwen, John mentions an important point that when you crafting legislation or policy, you don't do it for the incumbent. And that's something that the DA has been very vocal about in its fight against corruption for many, many years. I mean, what have some of the practical things been that we've done in Parliament as a party in fighting this kind of practice? Well,
if you look back, every one of the major big scandals was essentially taken on by the DA in Parliament. As far back as the arms deal, the Viridine scandal, Serafina, driven by Mike Ellis at the time, was the DA MP, the Waterkloof landing. At the front line of the fight against corruption has been the DA. And it's been a lonely battle sometimes. When you've taken on those battles in the past, you've been vilified by the media, you've been vilified by your opponents, and everything that we warned about, going as far back as when James Marburg, who was a DA researcher at the time, first started writing about state capture. The DA could see what was coming down the road, and it every time has tried to stop this from happening. It's been very, very difficult with a parliament with an overwhelming majority of governing party MPs, and you saw what happened to Gavin Woods and others when their scope had tried to intervene there. The ANC used the majority in Parliament to just simply ride roughshod over it, and were ably assisted by the presiding officers at the time. So what we have to do is to, as we've spoken about already, rebuild Parliament. Not only the buildings that we've seen that have burnt, we've got to rebuild the way Parliament operates. We've got to give it back its bite so that members of the executive who don't perform are able to be held accountable there, and it becomes a very uncomfortable place for people who are not doing their job. We've also got to look at the legislation that we need to pass. We've seen how easy it is, and remember, a lot of these regulations and laws were designed for a Mandela presidency in mind. They weren't designed for a nefarious individual like Jacob Zuma to be at the helm, or to have people in government like David Mabuza and others who don't have honourable intentions. And what we need to do is to firewall those institutions from ever being able to be captured by this again. So, for instance, if you let's look at a democracy like the United States. If there is a key appointment to a state or an entity, there are generally a set of congressional hearings that take place on the suitability of that candidate. It's not decided in some smoky back room. Parliament will interview, and that person will be grilled, and it will be done publicly, so that there is a proper process. And you could do then what Gwen is saying is get the best person for the job. Because if the ANC tries to put some cadre in who's not up to the job, that public hearing is going to expose that very, very quickly, that you've got a set of experts and this one person sticks out like a sore thumb because they don't know what they're doing. And it then makes it harder to appoint someone like that, a Dudu Myeni or a Tom Moyani, into one of those key positions. And then we've got to make sure that there are safeguards within the ROSE regulations to firewall that from ever happening again. And if we can get that right over the next 5 years as a legislative agenda as Parliament, I think we would have done a lot. Then, of course, it comes down to the prosecution authority as well. And that's the big question on everybody's lips. And the jury is still out on whether the prosecution authority has the resources, the talent, and the ability to be able to secure prosecutions in many of these instances. The NPA, remember, was also itself subject to state capture through the same processes as many of the state-owned entities and other Chapter 9s. And so their capacity has been hollowed out significantly over the years. We've got to look at creating a new anti-corruption agency. The ANC government did away with probably the most effective anti-corruption agency we've had in post-democratic South Africa, the Scorpions. And that was a very good model because it was a multidisciplinary focus. You had prosecutors working with forensic accountants, with attorneys, with police officers and detectives, able to build a case to secure the prosecution. I'm not sure whether we've got that capacity as it stands within the NPA at the moment. So we may need to look at creating a new agency, anti-corruption agency, that has that multidisciplinary capacity so that you can ensure that when a docket goes to court, you're going to secure the conviction. Because the worst thing that we will see happening, that we could see happening now, is that we get half-baked dockets going forward, from the Hawks and to the NPA. The police work is shoddy, it's sloppy, and you find these state capturists getting away on technicalities. And I think the message that would send would be terrible. So we've got to go hard off them with all that we have as a country to make sure they pay for the acts of omission and commission that they've perpetrated, particularly on those 30 million poor South Africans.
And with looking at that commission in particular, you also have to look at issues like funding and issues like who gets to form part of that commission and the independence of that commission or that entity, so that we can insulate that in itself from political interference.
There's no shortage of money. Why do we need a Department of Sports? Why is government interfering in sport all the time? We don't need a Department of Sport. Close down unnecessary departments, rechannel that funding to a prioritization. And this is the thing that makes me angry about the ANC, and it makes me angry particularly about President Ramaphosa, because they talk a good game. You saw the president's newsletter this week. We want to fight corruption. We've all got to be together in the fight against corruption. He can't fire people in his own cabinet from other parties who don't do their work properly and are undercloud. Never mind people like Lindiwe Sisulu from his own party. How do you expect South Africans to take you seriously when you release a letter saying we must all join the fight against corruption, when you cannot move against the people in your own party who you know are corrupt, who you know have stolen from the poor, who you know continue to run patronage networks? And this is the thing that frustrates me. It's time for action, not words. And unfortunately, the president, it's been almost 5 years now, has been a man of words, but very little action.
Speaking of words, we know the piece of legislation that you've introduced, a private member's bill that we've drafted, which would work very well with what John is talking about, this commission. What is it about, and how far are we? I mean, if people at home are wanting to know, how far are we with that legislation? When can we start to see it in action?
Yeah, so some of the viewers may remember that as far back as a year ago, the DA had introduced the End Cadre Deployment Bill to Parliament. And because of our long-standing work on this issue, we actually are in a position to offer a very comprehensive solution right from the word go. And so that bill is now before the committee. The Public Service and Administration Committee will be discussing that bill soon. And essentially what it does is what John was talking about. It outlaws the practice of smoky, backfilled rooms deciding beforehand who should be appointed to which positions on the basis of political loyalty. And it also really strengthens an institution which I think we don't discuss enough, which is the Public Service Commission. We have a Chapter 10 institution that is supposed to be the watchdog for human resource and public sector appointment, recruitment issues. And unfortunately, like many other things, it does not have the sharp teeth that it actually needs and the independence that it needs. But what the End Cadre Deployment Bill would also do is to bolster the independence of the Public Service Commission and actually give it the power to take remedial action against appointments that were made on the basis of anything other than merit, and actually for it to also oversee recruitment and selection processes in the public administration. John mentions departments that shouldn't exist. We shouldn't have a Public Service and Administration Minister and department. It should be run by the Public Service Commission. That's why they're there, and they should be independent of politics and a professional agency to oversee these issues. The other thing I want to just raise is Gwen's point about people, skilled professionals who have been locked out for many years from employment in the public sector because of cadre deployment. Decisions, as we can see clearly in the minutes now, where appointment decisions are overruled, where the ANC says that you need to add cadres to this list, and in fact the deployment committee will sometimes reserve for itself certain appointments that ministers then couldn't make. And the issue is then, of course, that competent professionals who are not ANC cadres apply for those jobs and they don't get it. So that's why, together with my colleague Michael Bagram, we've issued a call for South Africans who applied for positions that are discussed in these cadre deployment minutes to come forward, approach me or the DA or Michael Bagram so that we can look into your case. And here's something very exciting going forward. If we can show that positions that were discussed in the ANC cadre deployment minutes and that were predetermined essentially, and therefore constitutes unfair discrimination against other South Africans who are not cadres but who may have been better qualified for those positions, we can launch an assault on cadre deployment through that avenue as well. And all of this, Siviwe, leads up to the point where we have to uproot cadre deployment. We have to get it declared unconstitutional. We have to use Parliament with the End Cadre Deployment Bill, and we have to make sure that this is the critical reform that comes out of the State Capture Report.
Now, that's very important because Leon and I were both made sure that we were at the Zondo Commission in person when the President testified. And if we think that the revelations that have come out after these 3 years are some deterrent to cadre deployment, I'm afraid that what we heard the President telling the Commission was something completely different. He virtually, and Leon will bear me out, begged Judge Zondo not to make a finding that cadre deployment is unconstitutional, which shows that there's actually very little appetite within that organization to end cadre deployment. So it's very important that the public, civil society, academic organizations get behind this bill. Because what Leon's bill will do is do precisely that. It will insulate public institutions from ever being captured again, no matter which party's in power. I mean, it could be us in power at the next election if things go according to plan. What we want to do is to insulate it from ever being abused again, regardless of who's in power. And it'll be applied to national, provincial and local governments as well.
And as we're wrapping up, Gwen, I just want to bring you here in for a last bite on this. I think a lot of South Africans have almost given up on the idea of a capable state. And I mean, what are some of the key things from a DA point of view that we would want to, inject in making sure that we have a capable public service that serves people and does what it's meant to do?
If I may, Siviwe, I think, Leon and John have spoken a great deal about the public service and shielding it from, appointments that are based on considerations other than merit. But maybe as a final point, I would really just like to point out that part of the State Capture Report as well is highlighting the ways in which the state or, the civil service as well can be captured by elements outside of also party politics. And I think we mustn't, forget that. It is important, I think, one element of the broader legislative review that we must do is consider or explore how lobbying legislation might work in South Africa. South Africa does not have a comprehensive lobbying, legislative framework. And it is important because I think if you consider, for example, Bain Capital and their relationship with Jacob Zuma, consumer. In any other country, for example, in the US or the EU, a lobbying legislation is in place, it would not have been possible for the president to meet with the CEO of a company 17 times in a short period, which was effectively, I think, a meeting every 6 weeks, which was far more time than he's ever spent in Parliament, meeting with the CEO of a company. And it's not to say that these meetings should not occur. Of course, presidents should meet with CEOs and captains of industry and NGOs, etc. But when they become that frequent, even more than you meet with your own, Parliament, etc., it is important that that is at least on the public record. And I think just the fact of that kind of meeting being on the public record would have invited scrutiny far earlier than it did. We wouldn't have only learnt about it much later. So I think lobbying legislation and bearing in mind how we also rein in the influence of outside capture, not just party capture of state institutions, but perhaps private capture by other elements, the Guptas, companies that have been implicated, is also vital.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, as we're closing on, I mean, what are some of your marching orders in the next 6 months in the fight against particularly this practice?
Well, I'd have to hear from my leader about marching orders, but no, we've got a very comprehensive approach to this. The first thing is that we're continuing with our court case against the ANC because we want to obtain minutes and other records predating the May 2018 minutes that we currently have. The ANC has very conveniently said that minutes do not exist from prior to the May 2018 Cater Deployment Committee meeting, which is, of course, the period when President Ramaphosa was the chairperson between 2013 and 2018.
Which is strange because one of the sets of minutes confirms minutes from the previous meeting.
The first item in the first set of minutes is adopting the previous meeting's minutes. So clearly there is something, at least one set of minutes previous to the ones that we've obtained.
Yeah.
So we will be continuing with that court case. Hopefully we get a hearing in February, and so that we can expose a longer period of the activities of the deployment committee. And then, of course, the focus will be in Parliament, driving the End Cater Deployment Bill. We are hoping to get cross-party support. This is a moment for all of us to rally around solutions based on the findings in the state capture report. And so it is something that should cut across party lines. And the DA is open to input from other parties as well. The bill is there. Let's use the legislative process, as Professor Madonsela, as John has mentioned. Let's make sure that Parliament becomes the actual venue for debating and finding solutions. So the bill is there. Let's engage with it. And then just to repeat the call, anyone who sees positions that they applied for being discussed in these minutes, please approach the DA so that we can see if we can help you.
Absolutely. John?
So from us, three big priorities.
Yes.
First of all, get Parliament up and running.
Yes.
We must not allow the fire to distract Parliament from grappling with these issues. Yes, it's tragic what's happened, but a Parliament is more than bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
Parliament is the work that's embodied in the Constitution. And so we've got to move as seamlessly as possible into ensuring that we don't end up with a year's interruption, because I can tell you that year will be used to bury this report. So we've got to get Parliament up and running again and make sure its committees are working. Then we're going to be releasing a paper a little bit later in the month or early next month showing how we can turn Parliament from a lapdog back into a watchdog, and to do precisely what Professor Madonsela has spoken about, making sure that it's doing its duty by the citizens, not just by the party bosses. So that means overhauling questions, overhauling how questions are dealt with in committees, overhauling and make sure parliamentary committees are using their powers of subpoena to be able to call people. Had Parliament been doing all of this over the last decade, I think we would have had a far less impact of state capture, and we would have left very little room for it to happen. And then thirdly, making sure that we have an agency and that the NPA are able to go after these individuals. What we saw after the arms deal report, it took so long for the prosecutors to get their act together that by the time it came around to charging people, the main protagonists had either died, had left the country with their ill-gotten gains, or had moved on into other positions. And so nobody was held accountable. So those for me are the three big focuses this year, apart from the legislative agenda of getting this bill. And Leon's right. This bill is not a DA bill. It's a bill for South Africa. It's the first meaningful step being taken in the parliamentary process to assure South Africans that what has happened will never be allowed to happen again. And so the country's got to take ownership of this bill. They must write to their MPs. They must, doesn't matter if you're not a DA member, write to the person you voted to and say, I want you to support this bill. Civil society needs to get behind this bill. Academia need to get behind this bill. The Public Service Commission should get behind this bill because it's going to give them the teeth that they need to do the job that Chapter 10 of the Constitution says they must do. So it's going to be a busy year.
No. And you're absolutely right about this being not simply a DA bill. And ultimately, no political party has ever come out and said corruption is right. And so, therefore, we expect unanimous support when it comes to this bill, because actually everybody agrees that corruption has been the cancer in our public life in South Africa.